You think your job is hard? Try working 14 hours a day in a freezing workshop, lifting 100-pound presses, breathing in lead dust, and getting fined for a single typo. Oh, and don't expect a lunch break, or clean air, or pay if you're the apprentice. Close your eyes. Imagine a dim, wooden room. The air smells of metal, old ink, and damp paper. You hear the slow creak of a wooden press. It groans like it's alive. Someone pulls a heavy bar. The press thunders down. A page is born. But at what cost? In the 17th century, printing was revolutionizing the world. Books were spreading knowledge faster than ever before. Ideas were leaking through borders, churches, and crowns. Science, philosophy, rebellion, all inked onto pages. But behind that progress was pain. Each book came with sweat. Each word was pressed by tired hands. And the people who made it all possible, they suffered quietly in shadows. In this video, we'll take you deep inside a real 1600s print shop. We'll show you how these machines worked, who ran them, what they endured. You'll learn about the tools, the punishments, and the strange rituals that ruled the printer's world. We'll reveal facts most history books ignore, like why the youngest workers were called printers' devils, or how one wrong letter could cost you a week's wage. Stay with us till the end, because by the time it's over, you'll be grateful for every quiet moment you have. And you'll understand why you wouldn't last a single day in that world. This is Restless Historian, where we uncover the silent stories buried in time. If you love forgotten facts, dramatic truths, and peaceful history for the curious mind, subscribe now. And let's begin. The birth of the printing press in the middle of the 15th century. A quiet revolution was about to begin. One that would forever change how humans share ideas, preserve knowledge, and challenge power. It all started in a small workshop in Mainz, a German town on the banks of the Rhine River. A goldsmith named Johannes Gutenberg was about to invent something the world had never seen. Back then, books were treasures. Most were copied by hand, letter by letter, on expensive parchment. A single Bible could take a monk more than a year to finish. Only the wealthy kings, nobles, and scholars could afford to own them. For most people, books were something they would never touch in their entire lives. Gutenberg saw the problem. He dreamed of a way to copy books faster and cheaper. He wasn't a writer or a monk. He was a craftsman. But he had a powerful idea. What if letters could be made out of metal, arranged in lines, covered in ink, and pressed onto paper? And then, once the page was printed, the letters could be reused to make the next one. This idea would lead to the invention of movable, type individual metal letters that could be rearranged as needed. Gutenberg designed a special mold to cast the tiny letters quickly and accurately. He experimented with lead, tin, and antimony materials, soft enough to shape but hard enough to last. One by one, he created entire alphabets of reusable type, but that wasn't enough. The ink used for writing by hand was too thin. It would drip or smear on metal. Gutenberg had to invent a new kind of ink, thicker and oil-based, that would stick to metal letters and transfer cleanly to paper. It was messy, but it worked. Next came the press. Inspired by the wine and olive presses used by farmers, Gutenberg created a wooden screw press. When turned by hand, it pressed a damp sheet of paper onto the inked type with even pressure. The result was a clear, sharp printed page. Compared to handwriting, it was faster, cleaner, and identical every time. Around 1452, Gutenberg began printing religious texts, starting with small indulgences and eventually taking on a massive project, the Bible. His masterpiece, now called the 42-line Gutenberg Bible, was printed between 1454 and 1455. Each page contained 2 columns of 42 lines, carefully aligned and richly detailed. It was the first major book ever printed in Europe using movable type. He printed around 180 copies. Some were printed on parchment, others on paper. After printing, decorators added hand-painted details to make them look like traditional manuscripts. Today, only about 49 copies of this Bible survive, and they are considered priceless, though his invention was revolutionary. Gutenberg's personal story ended in misfortune. He had borrowed money from a businessman named Johann Fust to fund his work. When Gutenberg couldn't repay the debt, Fust took control of the printing operation. Gutenberg was pushed out of his own invention. He died in relative poverty, but his legacy would become one of the most important in human history. What followed was an explosion. Word of the new printing method spread like wildfire across Europe. By the late 1450s and early 1460s, former assistants and competitors had opened presses in other German cities like Strasbourg, Nuremberg, Cologne, and Basel. From there, it crossed borders quickly. In 1465, printing reached Italy. By 1470, Venice had become one of the largest printing centers in the world. Wealthy merchants and scholars there saw the potential. They set up workshops, trained workers, and began mass-producing books, not only religious texts, but also classical literature, science, medicine, and law. France followed closely behind. In Paris, printing began in the University district near the Sorbonne. French printers quickly developed their own styles and techniques. They printed in both Latin and the growing French language, helping to shape national identity. In Spain, the first presses appeared in Valencia and Barcelona in the late 1460s and early 1470s. Spanish printers worked closely with religious leaders, producing official texts for churches and monasteries. But soon, secular books and poetry found their way to the press as well. England was slower to adopt the technology, but it didn't take long to catch up. In 1476, William Caxton returned from Bruges and set up the first English printing press in Westminster. He printed the works of Geoffrey Chaucer and other early English writers, helping to standardize spelling and grammar in the English language. By the year 1500, just 50 years after Gutenberg's Bible, printing presses were operating in over 270 cities across Europe. These cities included Leipzig, Florence, Geneva, Krakow, Seville, Oxford, Bruges, and many more. Historians estimate that over 20 million books had been printed by the start of the 16th century. That number would grow to hundreds of millions by 1600. Printing transformed Europe. Books no longer belonged only to the elite. A merchant or even a skilled craftsman could now afford to own a Bible or a book of knowledge. Ideas spread quickly. Scientific discoveries, political theories, and religious arguments could be printed in days and shipped across borders in weeks. One of the most powerful examples of this was Martin Luther's 95 Theses, nailed to a church door in 1517. Within months, they had been printed and reprinted across Germany. His words, multiplied by the press, sparked a religious revolution. The Renaissance, which had already begun in Italy, was supercharged by the printing press. Ancient Greek and Roman texts were rediscovered, printed, and translated. knowledge, became a force available to anyone who could read. Universities grew, libraries expanded, literacy rates began to rise. But the rise of printing also brought challenges. Governments and churches feared the power of printed words. Censorship began. Certain books were banned or burned. Some printers were arrested or even executed. The printed word was powerful and dangerous. By the 17th century, the printing press had become a regular feature of European cities. But working in a print shop was anything but easy. It was hot, dirty, and physically exhausting. Workers stood all day, hunched over type cases or operating heavy presses. Ink got everywhere. Mistakes had to be fixed by hand, and deadlines were strict. But it all began with Gutenberg's simple vision to copy words faster. His press not only changed how books were made, it changed how people thought, how they argued, how they believed. It shifted the balance of power. And though he never got rich from his creation, Johannes Gutenberg sparked the single greatest communication revolution since the invention of writing. In the chapters to come, you'll discover how this invention shaped daily life in the 17th century. You'll walk through the press room, feel the labor, and understand why surviving even one day in that world would have tested your strength and willpower. What was a printing press like in the 1600s? By the 1600s, printing had spread across Europe and become an essential part of daily life for scholars, merchants, religious leaders, and even some of the emerging middle class. But despite how widespread printing had become, the machines used to create these books and pamphlets remained surprisingly primitive. No steam, no electricity, no automation, just a wooden press, metal type, heavy ink, and the pure muscle of tired workers. Let's step inside a typical print shop in the 17th century. The centerpiece of the room was the wooden screw press. It was bulky and rough-looking, but incredibly effective for its time. These presses had barely changed since Gutenberg's invention 150 years earlier. They were made mostly from oak or beechwood and designed to apply strong, even pressure over a flat surface. At the heart of the mechanism was the screw itself, a long, thick wooden rod threaded like a bolt, which turned to lower and raise the heavy platen. The platen was one of the key components of the press. It was a large, flat piece of wood or iron that pressed the paper down onto the inked type. When the pressman turned the handle, the screw would force the platen downward with immense pressure, pressing the paper evenly onto the type surface below. If the pressure wasn't even, the print would come out blotchy, blurred, or faint. But before the platen could do its job, there were other parts to prepare. First came the type tray, also called the form. This was a shallow metal or wooden frame where the printer arranged small metal letters called movable type into lines and columns. Each letter was a separate block, carefully chosen and placed in reverse so that it would print correctly. These letters were made of lead alloy and stored in a large wooden case with compartments for every character, punctuation mark, and special symbol. Typesetting was a slow and meticulous job. A skilled compositor might set around 2,000 characters in a day. One mistake meant resetting an entire line. And since each letter had to be placed upside down and backward, compositors developed a unique sense of reading and building text in reverse. They worked quietly, often bent over trays for hours at a time, squinting under candlelight or dusty windows. Once a page of type was complete and tightly locked into its tray, it was transferred to the bed of the press. That's where two other important tools came into play: the tympan and the frisket. The tympan was a thin frame, usually made of wood or iron, with a layer of soft material stretched over it like parchment or cloth. This created a slightly cushioned surface to hold the sheet of paper steady during printing. The paper was placed on the tympan, and then the frisket was lowered over it. The frisket was a second frame that fit exactly over the tympan and paper. It had cut-out windows in the exact shape of the text area on the page. Its job was to keep the paper from moving, protect the blank margins from getting inked, and prevent smudges. Together, the tympan and frisket formed a kind of paper sandwich that was folded down onto the type. But before printing, the type had to be inked. This was its own messy, demanding task. Printers didn't use rollers. Instead, they used it. Round leather-covered pads filled with horsehair, called ink balls. These ink balls were dabbed into a thick, sticky ink, then patted repeatedly onto the metal type to ensure even coverage. It was exhausting work. The ink was thick, heavy, and resistant. The printer had to make sure every single letter was inked properly to much ink, and the letters bled. Too little, and they didn't appear. With the type inked, and the paper in position on the tympan, the whole assembly was pushed under the platen. The pressman then turned the handle often, a long iron bar attached to the wooden screw. As the screw turned, it slowly forced the platen down onto the paper. A deep creak filled the room as the pressure built. This was the moment of truth. A single page was pressed into existence. Then the platen was raised. The tympan and frisket were opened. The printed sheet was carefully removed, still slightly dampened, hung on a line to dry. The same steps were repeated hundreds, sometimes thousands, of times a day. The labor was relentless. A typical press could produce about 250 to 300 pages per hour. That might sound impressive, but when you're printing a 400-page book with 1,000 copies, it becomes clear how physically and mentally draining this work was. Printers worked in teams, usually 2 men per press. One operated the screw, the other inked the type and handled the paper. Their hands were always black with ink, their clothes stained, their backs aching. The environment was hot and noisy. Most shops had stone or wooden floors, small windows, and low ceilings. Ventilation was poor. Candles and oil lamps added to the heat. In summer, ink would dry too quickly. In winter, the presses would creak from the cold. Dust from paper and lead particles from the type filled the air. And all the while, the rhythmic pounding of the screw press echoed through the building. Errors were common, and mistakes expensive. If one line was out of place, or one letter missing, the whole page might have to be reset. Proofreading was done, with eagle eyes, often by the same workers who set the type. Sometimes, a single spelling error wasn't noticed until the books were bound. In religious texts or royal documents, this could be dangerous, leading to fines or worse. The workers had to follow strict routines. In many shops, the day began at dawn and ended at dusk. The same motions, hour after hour: ink, press, release, reset. Meals were short, breaks rare. There was little room for distraction or laziness. The pace had to be maintained. Despite the challenges, these pressmen were proud of their craft. Some were apprentices learning the trade. Others were journeymen, moving from city to city. A few became masters and opened shops of their own. They often lived above the workshop, in cramped rooms full of printed sheets and tools. Even though the presses were all hand-powered, some improvements did emerge by the 1600s. Iron platen surfaces gave better print quality. Paper quality improved, and new fonts were designed for clearer reading. But the core of the process, the wooden press, the ink balls, the manual effort remained almost unchanged since Gutenberg's day. To walk into a 17th century print shop was to step into a world where knowledge was forged by hand. Every page bore the marks of human labor, the stains, the smudges, the slight misalignments. Each was a silent signature of the workers behind the press. And while the books they created spread ideas, revolutions, and discoveries, their own names rarely appeared on the pages. This was the printing press of the 1600s, a blend of invention and endurance, art and sweat. The machine itself was simple, but mastering it required precision, timing, and strength. It was not a place for the weak or impatient. Every printed word came at the price of someone's physical labor and constant focus. And this was just the beginning. Who worked there? The printing press may have been a marvel of invention, but it was only as powerful as the people who operated it. Behind every page of inked paper stood a team of hard-working individuals, each with a role to play. In the 17th century, a print shop was not just a room filled with machines. It was a living, breathing workspace where skill, hierarchy, and routine ruled the day. Step inside a typical print shop of the 1600s, and you'd find a strict order, a pyramid of labor built from experience and responsibility. Every man had a place, and every boy knew where he stood. At the top of the ladder was the master printer. He was the boss, the owner of the shop, and often the most experienced man in the building. A master printer didn't just run the press, he ran the business. He made deals with booksellers, scholars, and religious leaders. He arranged contracts with universities or governments. And perhaps most importantly, he decided what would and wouldn't be printed. Being a master printer took more than just technical skill. It required sharp business sense, legal awareness, and often a bit of political caution. The wrong book could lead to trouble, censorship, fines, or worse. Masters had to walk a fine line, keeping the press running while avoiding the wrath of the church or the crown. Some printed royal decrees. Others took risks, publishing controversial tracts or forbidden ideas. The master often had his own desk in the back of the shop, cluttered with papers, proofs, quills, and contracts. He didn't usually do the printing himself anymore. His time was too valuable. But he kept a watchful eye on everything, checking quality, guiding layout, correcting errors, and dealing with customers. When needed, he stepped in to solve disputes or make final decisions. Beneath the master were the journeyman, skilled workers who had completed their training and earned their place at the press. The word journeyman comes from the French, journey meaning day. These men were paid by the day and expected to pull their weight. Journeymen knew how to operate the press from start to finish. They could set type, ink plates, align pages, manage the press bed, and handle the tympan and frisket. Many had spent years as apprentices before earning the title. They were the backbone of the workshop, responsible for most of the physical labor that kept the shop running. Each press required 2 men to operate efficiently, one to ink the type and one to work the screw. Journeymen worked in pairs, switching roles throughout the day to prevent fatigue. It was grueling, repetitive work, and the days were long. Journeymen worked 10 to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. Pay was modest, but steady. Some stayed in one shop for years. Others moved between cities, looking for better wages or more creative freedom. If a journeyman proved himself reliable and saved enough money, he could eventually open his own shop and become a master. But this was rare. It required capital, connections, and approval from the local printing guilder, powerful organization that regulated who could print and where. Below the journeyman were the apprentice-sized young boys, often between 12 and 16, who had been sent to learn the trade. Their families might pay a small fee to the master for their training, or, in some cases, the boy would work for free in exchange for food, shelter, and instruction. An apprentice's life was hard. He lived in the print shop or in the master's home. His days began early and ended late. At first, he wasn't allowed to touch the press. Instead, he swept the floors, carried water, ground ink, and prepared paper. Over time, he was taught how to set type, clean forms, and eventually operate the press under supervision. Apprenticeships lasted several years, often 5 to 7. During that time, the boy became familiar with every tool, every process, and every danger of the print shop. He learned the names of every font, the feel of every weight of paper, and the scent of fresh ink on iron. Mistakes were part of the process. A dropped tray of type 1,000 tiny letters scattered across the floor was a disaster, but it happened. Apprentices had to pick up each piece, sort it back into its proper place, and keep working. They learned by doing, and if they misbehaved, punishment could be swift at cuff, on the ear, or a stern lecture from the master. But perhaps the lowest of all in the shop's hierarchy was the printer's devil, a term used to describe the youngest, most inexperienced boy in the workshop. His job was dirty, dull, and absolutely essential. No one knows for sure where the term printer's devil came from. Some say it referred to the ink-covered faces and hands of the young boys, who always seemed to look like little demons. Others claim the name had older, superstitious roots, fear that mischievous spirits might haunt the press and cause misprints or accidents. Whatever the origin, one thing was clear: the printer's devil did all the jobs no one else wanted. He cleaned the type with sharp brushes and rags soaked in alcohol. He refilled the ink balls. He trimmed paper. He fetched tools, swept floors, and was always nearby, ready to run errands or deliver messages. If something spilled, he cleaned it. If a page tore, he replaced it. He was the shop's runner, servant, and scapegoat. Despite the name, many printers' devils eventually became apprentices themselves. The role was often a foot in the door, an introduction to the world of printing for poor or orphaned boys. A few even rose through the ranks to become journeymen or masters later in life. Though the structure of the shop was strict, there was also a sense of camaraderie. These men and boys spent nearly every hour together. They shared meals, worked shoulder to shoulder, and passed down stories, skills, and jokes. They were part of a tradition, one that stretched back to Gutenberg and would continue for centuries. Some shops had just one press and a small team. Others were larger, with multiple presses, a dozen workers, and separate rooms for typesetting, inking, drying, and binding. The noise was constant: the clack of metal type, the creak of the screw, the splash of ink, and the steady chatter of men at work. It was a world of rhythm and repetition. There were no shortcuts. Every letter was placed by hand. Every page was inked manually. Every sheet was hung to dry. And behind it all were human hands, skilled, stained, and steady, working. In a print shop in the 17th century was not glamorous. It was not clean or easy. But for those inside, it was a source of pride. They were part of something bigger, disseminating knowledge, shaping language, and preserving the written word. A day in the life of a 17th century printer, the rooster, doesn't crow in this part of the city. The day begins not with song, but with the scrape of a door, the clatter of shoes on stone, and the faint echo of footsteps in a narrow alley. It's still dark outside. Cold air slips through cracked shutters. In the upstairs room above the print shop, a young journeyman blinks into the morning haze. He's been doing this for years, now rising before the sun, dressing in silence, reaching for the same threadbare shirt and ink-stained apron. Downstairs, the faint smell of old ink and damp paper never truly fades. It seeps into the wood, into the walls, into the skin of every man who walks through this door. The master is already at his desk. He doesn't look up. He doesn't need to. Everyone knows their job. The apprentices are the first to move. One begins grinding ink with a heavy muller on a stone slab, mixing lampblack with linseed oil until it reaches just the right consistency, thick, sticky, and dark. Another sweeps yesterday's dust from beneath the press, then stacks piles of rough, dry paper near the inking station. The printer's devil, no more than 12, carries buckets of water from the well and lays out clean rags. His hands are black by breakfast. The journeyman moves slower, but with practiced precision. One checks the forms, the locked frames of metal typeset the night before. Each letter, carefully placed by hand, must be tight and even. No slippage, no broken sorts. He slides a bone folder across the surface to feel for anything raised or loose. Another journeyman checks the tympan frame. The parchment is still firm. The frisket's cutouts line up properly. The press itself, made of oak, it's screw-worn. Smooth by years of use, it's in the center like a quiet giant, waiting to wake. And then the work begins. The press needs 2 men to operate. Efficiently, one to ink the type and one to run the screw. They rotate shifts to avoid exhaustion, though exhaustion always comes anyway. The first job is inking. 2 padded ink balls are dipped, dabbed, pressed, and patted again and again onto the surface of the type. It must be even. If ink pools in, the letters, the page will blur. If there's too little, the print will be faint. It takes hundreds of repetitions to develop a feel for it. Meanwhile, the other man lays a fresh sheet of paper onto the tympan and folds the frisket over it. He slides the bed into place, directly beneath the heavy platen. Then, with both hands, he grips the long iron bar and turns. The wooden screw groans. The platen descends. A second of pressure and release. The bed is pulled out. The paper is removed. The ink is checked. If it's clean, it's hung to dry. If not, it's set aside and counted as waste, and then it starts again. This rhythm continues for hours. Inking, placing, pressing, removing, hanging. A good team might produce 250 impressions. Pef. Hour if everything runs smoothly. But everything rarely does. Sometimes the ink dries too fast. Sometimes the paper curls or tears. Sometimes a single letter goes missing, and no one notices until 50 sheets have been ruined. There's no time to slow down. Deadlines are real. Customers are waiting. And books, unlike bread, cannot be rushed or eaten if they spoil. The air grows thick as the day unfolds, not just with heat, but with the scent of oil, the sharp taps of iron, the chalky dust from cut paper, and the sweat of 6 or 7 men, laboring in close quarters. Windows are few, and usually small. The light is uneven. Candles smoke in the corners. Everything tables, hands. Even the master's beard gathers a fine coating of black dust. There is no concept of comfort. In this world, no cushions, no breaks. Lunch, if it comes, is cold bread and hard cheese, eaten standing beside the press. The work doesn't pause for meals. Hunger becomes just another part of the day. Apprentices continue setting new type upstairs, crouched over wooden trays of tiny metal pieces. It's slow, eye-straining work. One wrong mover jostled tray. A sneeze and an hour's work is lost. Each page must be composed by hand, backwards, in reverse. Reading from right to left, thinking in mirrored lines. No wonder many apprentices eventually develop a unique way of reading and even dreaming in reverse text. Downstairs, the printer's devil is busy with water, paper, scraps, and ink. His job is never done. There are always more rags to clean, more forms to rinse, more trays to return to the case. He listens closely to the journeyman and watches how they work. He's learning, slowly, quietly. The master walks through the room. Now and then, he inspects sheets for quality, checks the ink consistency, and makes notes in a ledger. Occasionally, he barks a correction. If a margin is misaligned or a page offset by even a hair's width, he notices. And if a name is misspelled on a title page, it could ruin the entire job. Afternoon light creeps across the floor, drawing long shadows from the press handle and paper stacks. The room is warmer now. The men move more slowly, muscles aching from repetition, backs are sore, fingers blistered, eyes stinging, but no one complains. This is just another day, sometimes. There's a short break when a form must be changed, one set of pages removed, and a new one locked in. That's when the journeymen stretch their shoulders and wipe sweat from their brows. The apprentices lean against the walls and drink water. The devil steals a bite of bread and sits on the lower stair, but it never lasts. Soon, the press is humming again, like a slow drumbeat. Ink, place, press, pull, hang. A beat that repeats hundreds of times a day. Each sheet is part of something larger, a sermon, a law book, a poem, a scientific treatise. But here, in this room, it's just a rectangle of paper covered in rows of ink by evening. The candles burn lower, and the floor is littered with trimmed edges, ink-stained cloths, and discarded misprints. The journeymen clean the press, oil the screw, and check. The ink balls for wear. The apprentices stack the day's work in drying racks or on twined lines stretched across the rafters. No one talks much at the end of the day. Voices are hoarse, fingers twitch from effort, backs are stiff. The devil drags a bucket of grey water to the alley and dumps it with a tired splash. Eventually, the master nods. The shutters are drawn. The doors are barred. The day is over. But even in silence, the press seems to hum with the memory of motion pages pressed into history by hands no one remembers. And tomorrow, they'll do it all again. The compositor's job before any ink touched paper, before the press groaned to life, before pages were hung to dry, there was the compositor. Often unseen, often underappreciated, the compositor was the hidden craftsman of every printed book. It was his hands, not the pressman's, that gave shape to the words you now read in antique texts. And his job, nothing short of maddening, compositors, didn't operate machines. They didn't work with levers or wheels. Their tools were quieter metal sorts, wooden trays, a composing stick, a razor, a bodkin, and endless patience. They worked not at the press, but beside it, often in a dim, drafty corner of the shop, standing over a wooden case filled with thousands of tiny metal letters. These weren't just letters, they were individual pieces of movable type, small lead blocks, each engraved with a character in reverse. Some were worn from years of use, others chipped from careless hands, and yet others bent just slightly, enough to ruin an entire line of print if not noticed. Each day, the compositor received a manuscript handwritten, often messy, sometimes riddled with spelling errors or inconsistent punctuation. It was his job to turn that rough draft into rows of perfectly set type. He began with a composing stick, a narrow handheld tray into which the lines of type were assembled. With practiced fingers, he would reach into the wooden caster type case and select each letter one at a time. The layout of these cases was standardized. The capital letters were stored in the upper drawer, the lowercase in the lower one. That's where the terms uppercase and lowercase come from. Every compositor knew their location by heart. There was no time to search. It was a kind of choreography. The eye flicked across the manuscript. The hand darted to the right. Letter. Thumb and forefinger picked up the tiny piece, carefully placed it into the stick, and pressed it flush against the line. Then again and again, thousands of times each day, letters had to be placed in reverse. The line had to be built from left to right, but each letter faced the opposite direction. A compositor had to think in mirror image constantly. God save. The king looked more like a puzzle of mirrored glyphs when set in type, and still it had to be perfect. Spaces were not just blank areas. They were metal, too slightly thinner. Lower pieces called spaces, used to divide words without printing ink. Larger blocks called quads were used to create indents or center text. There were no automatic margins. Every space had to be calculated, measured, and tested. There were no shortcuts. If the line didn't fit the stick, it had to be adjusted manually. Words were hyphenated, shrunk, or sometimes stretched. The final line of every paragraph required judgment to loose, and it looked sloppy, too tight, and the letters bled. Together, the compositor had to feel the line with his fingertips, adjusting it by fractions of a millimeter. Silence filled the room. Compositors rarely spoke while they worked. It was not a social job. It was a mental exercise, a test of memory and vision. And the more pages a book had, the more relentless the labor became. Mistakes were punished harshly, not by the master necessarily, but by the work itself. One wrong letter meant a misprint. If an E was placed upside down, or an N used instead of a U, it might not be noticed until the proofs were pulled. Then the whole line had to be broken down, reset, and rechecked. Worse still, if a page was printed with an error and bound into a book before it was caught, it became permanent. There were no delete keys, no backspaces, only metal and muscle punctuation. Added to the difficulty, in the 17th century, punctuation wasn't standardized. Some authors liked commas everywhere. Others didn't use periods at all. Compositors had to follow the manuscript, no matter how strange it seemed. They weren't just printers, they were silent editors, shaping how a page would feel and flow to the reader. But they weren't always silent. Sometimes they added small touches of their own. A compositor might correct a spelling error if it seemed obvious. He might adjust a line break for better flow, and occasionally he inserted a tiny detail, a misprint, an extra letter, a faint space either by accident or as a hidden signature. In some rare cases, these became famous. Early editions of Shakespeare's plays have multiple versions because compositors made their own edits when setting the text. Each version tells a slightly different story. shaped by the hands of the men who assembled the words. Setting type wasn't just mechanical, it was artistic. For title pages, for poems, for religious tracts, the compositor had to lay out the text creatively. Italics, boldfaces, decorative initials, and line breaks were all chosen by hand. There was no preview screen. He had to imagine how the page would look once printed, even though he was reading it backwards, an upside-down dot. It took years to become truly skilled. Apprentices began by sorting and cleaning the type, learning the shape and weight of each piece. They practiced on scraps, setting short sentences again and again until they could do it without thinking. Eventually, they were allowed to work on real texts under supervision, of course, and only after many years would they be trusted to set a full page for a paying customer. Even for the best compositors, the hours were brutal. Standing all day, eyes straining, hands constantly in motion. Winter brought cold fingers and stiff joints. Summer brought sweat that blurred vision and soaked pages. Ink stained everything: clothes, skin, fingernails. The smell of metal and oil lingered for days. Sometimes the type was old and worn. Letters didn't line up perfectly. Lines sagged. Pages printed unevenly. A good compositor compensated, adjusting for wear and damage, but it was slow, frustrating work. Deadlines loomed constantly. Printers accepted contracts that promised delivery within weeks or even days. That meant setting thousands of letters per day. Compositors worked by candlelight if necessary, rubbing tired eyes and stretching aching backs between pages. Errors were costly. Customers rejected flawed books. Church officials demanded perfection in religious texts. The pressure was real, and in some cases, if the printed material was considered heretical or seditious, compositors risked more than just lost path. They could be arrested or punished alongside the master printer. Still, the job came with pride. Every completed page was a small miracular handmade arrangement of cold metal turned into living text. Compositors were the unsung authors of the printed age. They didn't write the words, but they shaped how those words were seen, read, and remembered. When a full form was completed, usually a page or tutit was carefully carried to the press, locked into the bed, and printed. After printing, the type was cleaned, returned to the cases, and the next page began. It was a cycle without end. Books, newspapers, sermons, proclamations, they all began with the compositor. His job demanded precision, patience, and a kind of invisible craftsmanship. The reader never saw his hand, but without him, nothing could be printed at all. The pressman's task, the printing press, sits at the center of the shop, like a sleeping beast. All around it, the noise of the day begins. Boots on floorboards, the crackle of fire, the shuffle of paper. But the press itself waits silent, heavy unmoving, until the pressman arrives. He doesn't wear the long robes of a scholar, or the ink-stained cuffs of a compositor. His clothes are rougher, his arms are stronger. His back has the shape of someone who bends and lifts for hours without complaint. The pressman is not a man of words. He is a man of motion, repetition, and weight. His task begins with ink, not from a bottle or a cartridge, but from two soft, round pads made of leather, stuffed with wool and soaked in linseed oil and lamp black. These are called ink bowls. They are dark, greasy, and slightly sticky. The pressman picks them up, one in each hand, and begins the ritual. Dabbing, dabbing, dabbing. The ink is not poured. It is worked. He presses the balls against a slab of stone where the ink has been laid. He pats them together until the ink is spread evenly across both surfaces. It must be smooth, not too thick, not too thin. The ink cannot drip. It must cling. Then he leans over the form, the locked arrangement of metal letters placed on the pressed bed, and taps the ink balls down with a steady, practiced rhythm. Tap, turn, press, lift. Each movement must hit the letters exactly, or the ink will miss. If he presses too hard, the type will clog. Too soft, and the page will print faintly. It's a dance, done in silence, guided by memory and feel. Every form is different. Some pages are dense with words. Others have white space, illustrations, decorative flourishes. The pressman adjusts with each page. He learns its shape, its demands. He can tell by the look of the metal whether it's ready. And once it is, the real labor begins. The tympan and frisket are prepared. These are wooden frames covered in parchment, used to hold the paper steady and protect the margins from ink. The sheet is carefully laid onto the tympan. The frisket folds over it. Everything must align perfectly. Then the press bed called. The coffin is rolled beneath the platen, the massive wooden block that will press the paper onto the inked type dot. This is where the strength of the pressman comes into play. He grips the handler, long iron bar extending from the side of the screw, and pulls. The screw turns. The platen descends. Slowly, powerfully. It presses down with incredible force. For a brief second, everything stops. The ink transfers. The letters leave their shape behind. Then, just as quickly, the platen rises. The bed is rolled back. The paper is removed. If all goes well, a perfect impression appears, sharp, even, clean. The sheet is hung to dry, and the process begins again. This task is repeated, not once or twice, but hundreds of times a day. Every single sheet, every page, in every book, passes through these same motions. Ink the form, lay the paper, press it down, pull it out, hang it to dry. Over and over, hour after hour, day after day. The pressman is not alone. He often works in pairs, switching roles to fight off fatigue. One inks while the other pulls. Then they trade. It keeps the work moving. It also prevents injury because this job is brutal on the body. The press is unforgiving. The screw takes strength to turn, especially after the 100th time. The ink balls grow heavy. The arms ache. The wrists strain. Shoulders burn. The weight of the platen, though counterbalanced by clever design, is still massive. And the bar, long as it is, demands full body effort. Worst of all, the job requires precision even under pressure. If the paper slips during pressing, the result is a double impression where the letters appear blurred or shadowed. This means the sheet is wasted. It also means a sharp reprimand from the master. Or worse, if too many sheets are ruined, payment could be docked. Slipped paper wasn't the only danger. Ink could splatter and ruin a full stack. The press bed could jam. The screw could stick, or worse, snap, sending splinters flying across the room. In older shops, pressmen sometimes wrapped their fingers to avoid injury from the platen's edge. Crushed fingers were not uncommon. Still, these dangers were rarely spoken aloud. They were part of the job, part of the pressman's world. In well-run shops, the rhythm of printing became almost musical. Ink, lay, press, pull, hang, a steady beat, like the ticking of a clock powered by sweat and skill. Two men working in sync, saying little, focused only on the page. Each printed sheet was a small victory. Each clean impression was a reward. The satisfaction of lifting a perfect page and hanging it. To dry was often the only recognition a pressman received. There were no signatures, no printed name at the bottom of the page saying who made it possible. The authors were remembered, the printers sometimes, the pressmen almost never, and yet, without them, the books wouldn't exist. They printed everything: religious sermons, royal proclamations, plays, poems, pamphlets, and protest leaflets. It didn't matter if the pressman agreed with the words. His job was not to judge. His job was to print in secret print shops where censored or illegal texts were made. The task grew even riskier. Pressmen worked by candlelight in hidden cellars or barns, listening for footsteps. If discovered, they could be fined, jailed, even tortured. But they still printed, still pulled the bar, still laid the paper, because printing was power, and the pressman, in his silent, physical way, held that power in his hands. He knew how the ink flowed. He knew how the press felt when the screw was tight or the form slightly off. He could hear the difference in a smooth pull versus a rough one. He understood the grain of the paper, the weight of the type, the temper of the ink. He was more than a laborer. He was a craftsman. When the day ended, his arms trembled. His clothes were stiff with dried ink. His hands were blackened, and his breath smelled faintly of oil and smoke. But in the drying racks above his head, hundreds of pages swayed gently, each one shaped by his effort, and tomorrow he would do it all again. The press would wait in silence. The ink balls would be ready. The handle would be in place, and the pressman, sore but steady, would return. Physical pain and fatigue, the print shop looked quiet to the casual eye. Wooden frames, stacks of paper, trays of metal, letters, but for the men who worked inside it, the space was an unrelenting battlefield, not of swords and gunpowder, but of aching muscles, raw fingers, swollen feet, and strained backs. There were no soft chairs, no breaks every few hours, no lunchrooms, no adjustable tables or padded mats. In the 17th century printing world, your body was the machine, and your endurance was the only tool that mattered. Every day began before sunrise. Whether you were a young apprentice or a seasoned journeyman, you stood, always. Standing wasn't optional. It was the default position from the moment you entered the shop until the day's quota was finished, minus 12. Sometimes 14 hours of straight labor on your feet. The floor beneath you was not wood softened by time or cushioned by rugs. It was hard, cold planks or rough stone, uneven in places, worn down by generations of footsteps, and your shoes, not comfortable, made of stiff leather with flat soles, often cheap and worn through. They offered no support, no cushion, and absolutely no relief. Your legs would start to ache by midday. A dull, throbbing pain at first, then a sharp burn round the knees and ankles. You'd shift your weight from foot to foot, trying to buy a few minutes of comfort, but the pain always returned. By the end of the week, some men wrapped their feet in cloth under their shoes just to soften the pressure. It didn't help much. Then came the back pain. The compositor bent constantly, over the case, over the stick, over the form. Type cases were angled, but they were still low. You had to hunch your shoulders and stretch your arms out to reach the tiny letters inside. The work required careful movements, and quick ones, so you were locked in a forward-leaning position, hour after hour. Even when you stood straight, it wasn't for long. You were soon back in position, shoulders curled, spine tight, neck craned. It didn't matter if you were young and strong, the pain found you anyway. And the pressman, he faced a different kind of strain. Pulling the press required full body effort. The bar was long and heavy. Turning the screw meant twisting your torso, digging in your heels, and pushing with everything you had. Over and over, hundreds of times. The pressure needed to print a single sheet wasn't light, and doing it for hours meant your shoulders, arms, and lower back burned constantly. Some pressmen used belts to support their waist. Others tied cloth around their forearms to hold the muscles in place. There were stories of men whose hands cramped so badly they had to be pried open at night by candlelight. Then there were the fingers. Every piece of type was made of metal, lead, tin, and antimony, soft enough to shape, but sharp on the edges if handled too quickly. The compositor's fingers moved constantly through trays of tiny letters. If your hand slipped, you could slice your fingertip on the sharp corners. If you moved too fast, the metal could dig under your nail or jab the soft skin of your thumb. Paper cuts were common too thin. Rough sheets, stacked high edges, stiff like blades. It only took one careless grab to leave a bleeding line across. Your palm ink got into every cut. It stung, it stuck. It turned your skin black and refused to wash away. And the ink didn't just stain your hands, it worked its way into your joints, mixing with sweat and dust, hardening beneath your nails. By the end of the day, your hands looked like they belonged to a chimney sweep, cracked, dark, swollen at the knuckles. No gloves were used. They would have made it harder to feel the type. The work demanded bare skin, no matter the condition of that skin. Even in winter, when your fingertips went numb, you worked on dot in cold months, the pain changed. Metal shrinks in the cold, becomes harder to handle. Fingers stiffened. The type felt like ice. Joints swelled. And in the damp, the chill crept through your shoes, up your legs, settling in your bones like a slow, aching fog. But summer brought its own miseries. The shop grew hot, especially near the press. The effort of pulling the bar, inking the form, and moving paper created a furnace of motion. Sweat dripped into your eyes. Pages stuck together. Your shirt clung to your back. Your hands slid on the ink balls. The paper curled in the humidity, refusing to lie flat. There was no airflow. Windows were few, and usually kept shut to protect the paper. The smell of ink, oil, damp parchment, and old wood mixed into a thick, sour scent. It stuck to your skin. Some days, it was hard to breathe. Still, you couldn't stop. The master expected progress. Pages had to be done. Clients were waiting. Books had deadlines. Even if your hands trembled, even if your legs shook, the work continued. Apprentices, often boys no older than 12 or 13, felt it most. They fetched paper, sorted type, carried heavy forms back and forth, cleaned the press, stirred ink, swept the floors. The older printers rarely let them rest. "You're still growing," they said. "You can handle it." But many didn't. Some collapsed. Some developed permanent injuries before they turned 20. There were no doctors who understood printing. Fatigue, no physical therapy. No one cared much about posture or spine health. A man who complained too much was seen as lazy. If you couldn't keep up, you were replaced. It was that simple. Rest wasn't built into the day. You might grab a quick bite while standing. Some shops allowed a midday break, but only if you were ahead of your quota. Most simply worked through it. If you stopped, it meant someone else had to pick up the slack. That bred resentment. So you kept going, even when your hands stopped, responding the way they should. And when the day ended, long after sunset, the pain came into focus. It was no longer hidden by motion. It settled over you. You felt it in your hips, your neck, your wrists. You noticed how hard it was to lift your arms, how heavy your fingers had become. You found bruises you didn't remember getting, cuts that had dried without your notice, stains that would stay for days. Some men developed permanent conditions: curved backs, frozen shoulders, bent fingers. They joked about it, called it printer's stoop or pressman's claw. But the truth wasn't funny. The job took its toll year after year, yet they returned, because printing was more than a trade. It was a calling, a craft, a link in a chain of knowledge that stretched across countries and centuries. The pain was the price of spreading ideas, of making books, of turning empty paper into something that could change minds. And so, every morning, the printers stood again, even when their feet were swollen, even when their joints cracked, even when their hands throbbed with every movement. They stood and they printed. The environment imagines stepping into a print shop in the 17th century. Not the romantic image of old books and quiet wisdom, but the real space, the working space, the space that hits you before your eyes can even adjust. The first thing you notice isn't the sound, it's the smell. It clings to everything: the wood, the walls, the workers. A heavy mix of linseed oil, wet paper, burnt charcoal, drying ink, and something metallic, like rust or blood. That's the lead dust. It floats in the air, fine as flour, invisible to the eye, but thick in the lungs. And human sweat always, layered beneath it all. Old sweat, soaked into leather aprons and stained sleeves, hanging in the corners where coats are left to dry. There is no breeze to clear it. The windows are small. In some shops, they're sealed shut. The fear is that a gust of wind could scatter paper, knock over type trays, or blow dust into drying ink. So the air sits, trapped, unmoving. It grows stale quickly, thick and warm by mid-morning, heavy with breath and heat by noon. In summer, it becomes unbearable. The ceiling is low. The roof absorbs the sun. Inside, the pressmen and compositors move slowly, deliberately, slick with sweat, their shirts soaked and stuck to their backs. Ink softens in the heat and smears more easily. The type grows slippery. Fingers fumble. Tempers rise. Some workers tie cloths around their necks to catch the sweat before it drips onto the page. Others wrap rags around their wrists, not for comfort, but to keep their hands dry enough to grip the tools. The smell intensifies. The air begins to taste bitter, like iron and smoke. The shop's fire, once comforting in colder months, becomes another burden. Even if the hearth isn't lit, the press generates its own heat through friction, through effort, through constant motion. There is no relief, no shade, no ice. Just the relentless weight of summer pressing down from above. And yet winter is worse. The cold enters first through the feet. The floor is stone or wood, and there's no insulation, no rugs, just thin-soled shoes and cold that bites through them. By morning, your toes are numb. The ink balls stiffen. The metal type is freezing to the touch. Pressmen wrap their fingers in cloth, not for safety, but to avoid frostbite. Compositors warm their hands over the fire whenever they can, but the heat doesn't last. You can't wear gloves. You need your fingers bare to feel the letters, so you work through it. You blow on your fingertips between lines. You stamp your feet when no one's looking, but your spine curls tighter. Your shoulders hunch against the chill. It creeps into your bones. Paper reacts badly to cold. It grows brittle. The corners curl. Sometimes it cracks when pressed. Ink thickens. It must be warmed gently to keep it flowing. The whole process slows. Every step feels harder, heavier. The press resists. The screws stick. The oil clots. You can't see much either. Light is scarce. The windows are small. And even when they let in sunlight, it only reaches the front of the room. The rest remains dim. In the deeper corners, everything is done by candle or oil lamp. Flickering light, bouncing shadows. A compositor might strain his eyes for hours just trying to distinguish a lowercase n from a lowercase u. Mistakes happen more often in low light, and each mistake can mean redoing a whole page. So compositors lean in close, squinting, sometimes just inches from the stick. They blink constantly. Their heads ache from the effort. Over time, their vision suffers. Some go half blind by the time they're 30. There's no rest for the eyes. You look down to set type. You look up to scan the proof. You look sideways to find the next letter. The movement never stops. The effort is endless. Dust is everywhere. It collects in the corners. It hides between floorboards. It gathers in the grooves of the press and in the air above the paper stacks. Much of it is from the paper itself, tiny fibers torn by cutting, handling, pressing. But some is from the type cases, where worn metal breaks off into invisible flakes. Lead dust on it lingers in the air, on your clothes, in your hair. No one knew its danger at the time, but the symptoms were already showing. Print workers were trembling. Hands, swollen gums, pale skin, numb fingers, headaches that never faded, all early signs of lead poisoning. And yet, no one stopped. No one connected the dots. This was just part of the job. The print shop wasn't silent either. There was constant sound, but not of voices. Talking was discouraged. Silence meant focus. Mistakes cost money. So instead, the room echoed with dull, repetitive noises. The soft thud of ink balls, the clank of the press handle, the shuffle of pages, the occasional hiss of hot metal poured into new type molds. Every now and then, someone cursed softly when a letter slipped or a sheet tore. But mostly, the workers just breathed, loud and slow, through mouths lined with dust and soot. In this closed, stale space, everything became worn. Tools dulled faster, would split, leather cracked, paper yellowed if left out too long. Even time itself felt different, slower, heavier. The hours didn't pass. They dragged. The environment shaped the people too. Their backs curved to match the typecase. Their skin took on the colors of the room, grayish, ink-streaked, smoke-tinted. Their eyes adjusted to the gloom, pupils wide like animals that lived underground. Their hearing sharpened to the sound of paper slipping, type dropping, the subtle catch in a turning screw. They aged quickly. Hands shook earlier. Joints stiffened younger. Most printers, by middle age, looked a decade older, but still they worked. There was pride in the craft, even when the surroundings offered no comfort, and there was always danger. A spilled bottle of oil near the hearth could start a fire. An unstable press could crush a hand. An unattended candle could fall onto a pile of paper. Fire was the ever-present threat. Entire print shops had gone up in smoke within minutes, leaving only charred wood and half-printed pages behind. But still, they printed. They stood in rooms where the air never moved, where the heat burned or the cold cracked, where light barely touched the corners. They pressed pages in the dark. They smeared ink with aching arms. They breathed dust and burned oil and stood on numb feet. The print shop wasn't just a workplace. It was a world, a small, enclosed universe of pain, patience, and persistence. A place where knowledge was born from discomfort, where every book began in shadow, materials and tools before a single word could be printed, before the press even moved. The printers of the 17th century had to gather their most important weapons, ideas, but materials, and every one of them came with a cost. The first and most fragile was paper. Today, paper is cheap, disposable, but in a 17th century print shop, paper was precious. It wasn't made by machines. It didn't come in neat reams from a warehouse. Each sheet was handmade, created by craftsmen who soaked linen rags in water, beat them into pulp, and then pressed that pulp into thin, wet layers using mesh molds. It was a slow process, laborious, and the results were never perfectly even. Some sheets were too thick in one corner, others were too thin in the center. Edges frayed, surfaces rippled. Every piece was slightly different, temperamental and expensive. Printers couldn't afford to waste it. They stored paper carefully, covered it, counted each sheet. Apprentices were often tasked with preparing stacks, making sure each page was aligned, dusted, and dry. Even so, mistakes still happened. One drop of ink in the wrong spot, one press plate slightly off, and the entire sheet was ruined. And the ink, that was no easier. Ink in the 17th century wasn't poured from bottles. It was mixed by hand. The ingredients were few, but they had to be measured with care. Soot or lampblack for pigment, linseed oil for body, sometimes a touch of resin or turpentine to thin the mixture. It was thick, sticky, more like paste than liquid. If it was too dry, it clumped. If it was too wet, it bled into the paper. The balance had to be perfect, enough to sit cleanly on the surface, but thin enough to transfer fully from type to page. The ink balls leather pads stuffed with wool were dipped, pressed, and twisted over the type again and again. Each time, the pressman had to judge the ink by eye. Was it too glossy, too dull, too runny? One wrong move, and the whole sheet had to be done over. Ink was costly. Soot was cheap, but the oil wasn't. And good ink, consistent ink, was rare. Some printers tried to stretch their supply by watering it down. Others scraped dried ink from the press and reused it. But reused ink lost its depth. It smudged more easily. The results were always less crisp. Type itself, the heart of printing, was made from metal. Not steel, but an alloy, lead, tin, and antimony. Soft enough to cast, durable enough to hold a shape, but far from indestructible. Each letter, each punctuation mark, was its own tiny piece. Stored in wooden trays, called cases, uppercase letters in the top drawer, lowercase letters below, hence the names. A full page might use hundreds of these tiny blocks. They were arranged in a composing stick, locked in place, then transferred to a frame called a galley. It was precise work. If one piece was missing, the line wouldn't hold. If one piece was damaged, the impression would be uneven, and damage was common. The type wore down quickly. After enough use, sharp corners dulled. The clean edge of a serif would round off. The base might chip. When dropped, the type often bent. Printers reused every piece they could, sometimes filing it down, sometimes turning a damaged C into a usable G or O if the curve was still intact. But this was risky. Every reused piece increased the chance of error, and when letters were misread or misprinted, it reflected badly on the entire shop. Casting new type took time and materials. Molten metal was poured into molds, cooled and trimmed. This was hot, dangerous work. Lead fumes filled the air. The molds had to be handled with care. One slip and a hand could be burned or worse. So shops reused what they had, patched what they could, and carried on. Even the tools themselves, frames, forms, knives, spacers, chasers, were mostly wood or soft metal. They broke, they warped, they cracked with changes in temperature and humidity. But replacements weren't always available. If something snapped mid-process, the work stopped. Sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. Printers became craftsmen not just in their printing, but in repair. They learned to fix warped forms, to refile broken spaces, to sand down rough wood. There were no backups, no replacements. Everything had to be maintained, preserved, and used to its last breath. Some tools were passed down for generations. A composing stick used by an old master might still be in use decades later, its surface worn smooth by 1,000 thumbs. Presses themselves were rarely new. They were sold, traded, rebuilt, each one with its own creaks and quirks. Learning the rhythm of a press was part of the training. Like learning an instrument, if you rushed it, it would jam. If you pushed too hard, it would shift out of alignment. Even the oil that greased the press was used sparingly. A good pressman knew how to stretch a bottle over weeks. One careless spill could soak the paper stack, ruin the day's work, and cost a small fortune in lost supplies. Resources were limited. Everything was reused. Paper was turned over and used for proofing. Failed sheets were cut into scrap for testing. Old type was melted down and cast anew. Rags from the paper mill were delivered in bulk, but they had to be cleaned, sorted, processed. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was taken for granted. Printers often shared tools. One composing stick passed between two journeymen. One drawer of E-type rationed carefully so no project had to pause. If a case was dropped and letters scattered, everyone stopped to help sort and replace them. Not out of kindness, but necessity. Replacing a full case of type could bankrupt a small shop. And all of this was before the printing even began, before the screw was turned, before the first impression was made. Behind every book, every pamphlet, every broadsheet from the 17th century, there was a mountain of invisible labor, preparation, preservation, improvisation. The world of print was not clean. It was not simple. It was a daily struggle to make do with limited materials, failing tools, and a constant threat of delay. Printers became experts not just in language, but in logistics, managing supplies, calculating ink, forecasting paper needs, knowing how long their type would last, when to patch a cracked form and when to risk casting a new one. It was a balancing act between time, money, and the ever-present danger of running out. And when shortages did happen, printers got creative. Sometimes they'd print smaller fonts to save space, or switch paper halfway through a project, hoping the readers wouldn't notice the texture change. Some reduced margins, others reworded passages to avoid rare letters that had run short. Complex vocabulary for words that could be built from whatever type was still on hand. Even punctuation was flexible. If the print shop ran out of commas, they substituted periods. If a dash wasn't available, a pair of hyphens would do. Language bent around the limitations of the tools. Style and grammar often bowed to the demands of supply. And yet, despite all this, despite the shortages, the breakdowns, the wear and tear, the books still came out. Some were rough around the edges, some had misprints, some had uneven ink or soft impressions, but they were read, they were shared. They spread ideas across continents, because behind every printed word was a craftsman, standing in the dim light of a smoky shop, piecing together sentences from metal and ink, trusting that their worn tools and fragile paper could carry meaning across time. And more often than not, they did. Common mistakes and punishments in a 17th century print shop. Perfection wasn't a luxury, it was a demand. A single mistake, one wrong letter, one misaligned line could undo hours of work, and the consequences. They were swift, strict, and often painful. Printing was a business. Time was money. Materials were expensive. There was no room for sloppiness. Every page had to be exact, every line straight, every word spelled correctly. If it wasn't, someone paid for it, and usually it wasn't the master printer. Mistakes started at the composing bench. This was where the compositor worked, hunched over wooden type cases, setting each letter by hand. It was delicate work. One wrong letter and the meaning changed. One backwards B or upside down N, and the entire line became unreadable. Sometimes the mistake was small. An extra space, a missing comma, a hyphen dropped between two syllables. But even that could change how a sentence was read or make a page look unprofessional. And in this world, appearance mattered. Compositors were expected to catch their own mistakes. They double-checked every line before locking it into the form. But after hours of bending, squinting, and sorting metal letters, fatigue set in. And with fatigue came errors. Mistakes were caught during proofreading. A separate worker, or sometimes the master himself, would read a test, print called a proof, line by line. They compared it to the original manuscript, watching for misspellings, missing words, misaligned type. When they found something wrong, they circled it or marked it with symbols in the margins. Then came the scolding. If the error was minor, the compositor might get a sharp word or cold stare. But if it was repeated or serious, the punishment. Escalated fines were common. Journeyman compositors were paid by the sheet or by the job. A deduction was made for every mistake. Sometimes a full day's wage could be taken for a single misprinted page. If the error ruined a full batch of printed sheets, the worker could be forced to pay for the paper and ink used. It didn't matter that the materials had already been used. The message was simple. You made a mistake, you pay. Masters were strict. They had to be. Their name appeared on the title page of every book that left their shop. If an error was found in the final copy, it wasn't just the compositor who looked bad. It was the whole press. Clients would complain. Reputation would suffer. Future work might be lost. So masters ruled with iron discipline. Rules were posted. Expectations made clear. Some masters kept books to record every infraction. Late arrivals, sloppiness, repeated typos. Others didn't write anything down. They preferred to speak with actions. A missed deadline. The shop stayed open, latent. No one went home until the pages were done. A damaged batch of paper. That cost was docked from wages. No questions asked. And if the apprentice was the one who made the mistake, the punishment could be physical. Apprentices were young, sometimes as young as 12. They were expected to learn quickly, listen carefully, and follow orders without question. When they didn't, they paid a price. The master had legal authority over the apprentice. He could discipline him as he saw fit. That often meant being slapped for sloppy work, whipped for disobedience, locked in a cold room for speaking out of turn. Public humiliation was common. Apprentices might be forced to wear signs announcing their mistake, or clean ink rollers with bare hands as punishment. It wasn't just cruelty, it was control. These punishments created fear, and fear kept the press running smoothly. No one wanted to be the one who misspelled a title, or misprinted a royal decree. Those were the worst errors of all. When the client was the church or the crown, perfection wasn't just expected. It was demanded. One wrong word in a Bible verse could lead to scandal. One misplaced phrase in a royal edict could be considered treason. And in those cases, the punishment wasn't just internal. Authorities might find the entire shop, confiscate copies, even shut the press down. Some printers were jailed for publishing errors that were seen as political or blasphemous. Others were forced to reprint entire books at their own expense. Those costs could destroy a small business overnight to avoid. Such disasters, master printers pushed their workers hard. Proofreading became obsessive. Some shops read every word out loud in pairs, one reader, one checker comparing every sentence to the original manuscript again and again. If errors still made it through, blame fell on whoever was assigned to that shift. And apologies didn't matter. Results did. Mistakes in layout brought another set of troubles. If the page was crooked, or margins weren't even, the master would demand a full reset. That meant taking apart the entire form, letter by letter, and rebuilding it. It could take hours, and those hours weren't paid. Sometimes the page was perfect, but the press wasn't. If the type slipped, if the press handle jammed, if the ink dried too fast, even those mechanical errors could be blamed on the workers. It was their job to maintain the tools, to spot problems before they caused real damage. Failure to do that was seen as neglect. In many shops, repeated mistakes meant dismissal. Even experienced journeymen weren't safe. If a printer developed a habit of spelling errors or alignment issues, he'd be quietly pushed out, replaced by someone younger, cheaper, more obedient. No one wanted a worker who cost more than he produced. For the apprentice, the stakes were even higher. A mistake in the early years could follow him for life. If a master thought an apprentice was lazy or careless, he might refuse to write the certificate needed to graduate. Without that, the apprentice couldn't become a journeyman, couldn't work at another shop, couldn't open his own press. His future ended before it began. Some gave up and left the trade entirely. Others stayed, working in silence, terrified of slipping, terrified of missing one line of Latin, terrified of confusing I with J, or setting a letter in the wrong direction. Type was small. Mistakes were easy to make, hand hard to hide. And the worst part, there were no second chances once the print run began. A full batch of 500 or 1,000 pages could be printed in one day. If the error was discovered on page 3, every copy was already ruined. Sometimes, the shop would try to scrape off the ink and print over it. Other times, they'd print a correction notice and insert it. But often, they simply had to reprint everything. The costs were devastating. Wasted paper, wasted ink, wasted hours. Clients angry, reputations damaged. All because one worker let a period fall where it didn't belong, or mistook king for kind, or forgot to check a line before locking the form. In the end, the press didn't forgive. It demanded perfection from imperfect people. So the workers trained their minds to catch errors before they happened. They developed routines, rituals, checking each letter twice, reading backward, reading aloud, holding pages up to candlelight to spot uneven inking. Some even memorized entire texts, just to spot when something felt wrong. It wasn't just a job, it was survival, because in the world of printing, one letter out of place wasn't a small thing. It was everything. Health hazards. Working in a 17th century printing press didn't just wear you down mentally, it could destroy your body. The dangers weren't always loud or sudden. They were quiet, slow, invisible, but they were everywhere. In the ink, in the air, in the metal, and in every movement that had to be repeated over and over for hours, days, and years. Let's start with the most silent threat: lead. Every letter the compositor touched was cast in it. Every word on the page was pressed into shape by it. Lead was the lifeblood of the print shop, and the poison running through it at the time. No one fully understood the effects of lead poisoning, but the symptoms, they were very real. Shaking hands, stomach pain, memory loss, constant fatigue. Over time, workers might develop strange rashes or suffer from bleeding gums. Some even lost teeth. Handling the type meant constant contact with lead dust. Sorting letters, placing them into the form, pulling them out again, day after day, often without washing their hands. And during long shifts, it was common to eat with those same fingers. A piece of bread, a hunk of cheese, all carried microscopic particles of lead directly into the body. Over time, the damage added up. Journeymen, who had spent 10, 20 years at the case, began to tremble. They couldn't hold tools steady. Their speech slowed. Some grew confused, angry, paranoid. And while no one at the time said, "This is lead poisoning," many simply said, "He's going mad." Madness in the press room was not uncommon. But lead was just one danger. There was also ink. Inks used in the 17th century weren't made with clean, modern ingredients. They were mixtures of oil, soot, resin, and other chemicals. Some included turpentine or sulfur. Others were made using compounds that contained mercury or copper. The exact recipe varied from shop to shop, but the result was the same: strong, oily, noxious fumes. The smell of ink filled the press room. It clung to skin, it soaked into clothes, and it was impossible to avoid. Printers who worked the rollers often had ink smeared from wrist to elbow. They washed with lye, soap-strong, abrasive, painful on cracked skin. Over time, many workers developed blisters. Cuts became infected. Some suffered from chronic skin, irritation, redness, itching, raw patches that never fully healed. And then there were the lungs. Press rooms were enclosed spaces. Windows were small. In the winter, they stayed shut. In the summer, they barely opened. There were no exhaust fans, no fresh air systems, no filters. So the air grew thick with dust from the paper, with fumes from the ink, with smoke from candles and lamps. Printers breathed it all in. Over years, this led to coughing fits, shortness of breath, chronic congestion. Many workers likely suffered from asthma or bronchitis, though no one called it that then. Some lived with a permanent wheeze. Others developed tuberculosis, often blamed on bad luck or cold winters. The cause was right in front of them, the air they breathed every day. And it didn't stop there. The joints suffered. 2.compositor stood for hours bent at awkward angles over their type cases. They twisted, reached, pulled all day long. Knees ached, backs stiffened, shoulders froze, wrists became inflamed. There were no stools, no breaks. The work was meant to be continuous. And when the body began to resist, there was only one answer: push through it. For pressmen, the ones who operated the heavy screw presses, the toll was different, but just as brutal. They pulled thick wooden levers again and again, hundreds of times a day. Each pull required strength and control. Over time, it wore down the shoulders, elbows, and spine. Muscles swelled, then tore, discs slipped. Some pressmen developed what we might now call repetitive strain injuries or herniated discs. But again, there was no name for it, only pain. They wrapped their joints with cloth, rubbed them with hot oil, but there was no cure. Eyes were another casualty. The lighting in most shops came from candles, or from narrow windows that let in little sun. Even in the best hours of daylight, shadows danced across the pages and type. Compositors had to lean close sometimes with magnifying glasses to catch small details. Straining the eyes was part of the job. Letters blurred, focus wavered. After 10 or 12 hours, everything began to look the same. E and C could be mistaken. U and N reversed. Mistakes were blamed on carelessness, but the truth was more physical. Their vision was deteriorating. Some compositors, by their 30s, could no longer read clearly. Some continued working with poor eyesight because they had no other way to earn a living. Others were quietly replaced. No one wore glasses in the press room, unless they were wealthy or lucky. Most couldn't afford them. And even if they could, glasses at the time were crude, heavy, hard to use for precision work. So the eyes just wore down, silently. Another danger came from the constant noise and tension. While printing wasn't as loud as a forge or mill, it had its own sounds. The creak of the press, the thump of the platen, the hiss of paper brushing against paper, the muttered instructions between workers. And over all of it's the ever-present awareness of deadlines, of being watched, judged, evaluated. Stress wasn't just emotional. It caused ulcers, headaches, and heart trouble. Pressmen worked with the knowledge that a mistake might cost them their job, or bring punishment, or ruin the master's reputation. That pressure lived in their bodies, and through all of this, there was no safety gear. No gloves to protect against lead or ink, no masks to filter the air, no aprons thick enough to prevent blisters, no goggles for eye protection, no earplugs, no ergonomic supports, nothing. If a pressman caught his hand under the platen, it crushed his fingers. If ink splashed in the eyes, he washed it with water and hoped it didn't burn. If type fell, it could bruise or break a toe. There were no steel-toed boots, just soft leather shoes, often worn thin. Injuries were common, but unless they were severe, workers stayed on the job. Missing a day meant lost pay. Falling behind on work meant fines. Weakness wasn't tolerated. There were others ready to take your place, and if you died, you were replaced by morning. The press didn't stop for the sick, the injured, or the dead. Its gears turned regardless. Its orders had to be filled. Its deadlines loomed. And those who dared to slow down or ask for rest were considered lazy, unfit, expendable. This wasn't industry. It was endurance. A test not just of skill, but of how much pain and poison a body could withstand before it broke. The men who worked the presses were often sick, sore and scarred, but they showed up anyway, because there was no other option, because the press demanded everything, and it took it inch by inch, day by day without apology. The social side, 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, in the same room, with the same people. The printing house wasn't just a workplace, it was a world, a loud, ink-stained, tightly wound world, where every person had a place, every minute had a purpose, and personal space was a luxury no one could afford. There wasn't much time for laughter in the press room, but sometimes it slipped through the cracks. It might start when a journeyman accidentally dropped a full case of type and groaned loud enough to make others look up, or when an apprentice read a proof aloud and couldn't keep a straight face. If the typesetter had slipped in a joke, hidden in Latin, knowing no one else would notice. These moments were rare, but they mattered. Most of the day passed in silence. Compositors worked shoulder to shoulder, eyes locked on the cases of metal, type in front of them. Their hands moved in a rhythm so precise, it looked like choreography, picking, setting, adjusting, checking. Over and over again. There was no time for chatting, no room for daydreams. Pressmen were more physical. Their movements were louder. The press creaked, the platen thumped, paper rustled, ink hissed against the roller. But still conversation was limited, short commands, occasional curses, instructions muttered under breath. Talking wasn't banned, exactly. But in the press room, work spoke louder than words. Even so, relationships formed. When you spend more time with your co-workers than your own family, something grows, whether it's friendship, rivalry, or resentment. Some compositors became close. They shared food, warned each other about the master's mood, or helped correct a mistake before it was noticed. Others kept their heads down, trusting no one. Not everyone got along. Tension simmered, elbows bumped, eyes rolled. A single misplaced word could lead to days of cold silence. And yet, despite the stress, the exhaustion, the endless repetition, there were flickers of warmth. Sometimes during proofreadings, when a form was set, it had to be checked before the final print run. Someone, often an apprentice, would read the text aloud, while another followed along, word by word, with a printed proof. It was tedious work, but also a strange kind of entertainment. The reader might stumble over complicated words or laugh at a clever sentence. If the text was a play or a satirical pamphlet, the entire room might pause, just for a moment, to listen. There was power in the printed word, and in a world where many workers couldn't afford books of their own, this was one of the few ways they could engage with ideas larger than the shop. It was also a reminder. Everything they printed mattered. Even if they didn't write it, even if they didn't believe it, they were the ones who gave it life. Still, not all voices were equal in the press room. There was a strict hierarchy, and everyone knew where they stood. At the top was the master, printer. He owned the shop. He secured the clients. He decided the deadlines. His word was law. Some masters were fair, even kind. Others were harsh, demanding, unpredictable. But all were respected or feared. Below him were the journeymen, experienced workers who set type, managed presses, supervised apprentices. They were the backbone of the operation, skilled, reliable, and constantly under pressure to perform. Then came the apprentices, often boys, sometimes as young as 12. They did everything no one else wanted, to do cleaning, fetching ink, carrying type, standing for hours without complaint. Their contracts lasted 7 years. During that time, they earned almost nothing. They lived in the shop or in a cramped attic above it. Their lives were controlled entirely by the master, and they were reminded of that often. Rules were strict. Discipline was common. An apprentice who spoke out of turn, arrived late, or made a mistake could be punished, fined, locked out even, beaten. There was little room for rebellion. You learned your place or you suffered. Some journeymen sympathized with the apprentices. Others bullied them. It was part of the cycle. Those who had suffered as apprentices often repeated the same behavior once they climbed the ranks. Not out of cruelty, but because that's how the system worked. That's how it had always been. And rising through the ranks wasn't easy. Even after finishing an apprenticeship, a young man might spend years as a journeyman before ever dreaming of owning his own press. The equipment was expensive, the competition fierce, the licenses limited. For most, the dream remained just that, a dream. So they stayed in the press room day after day, year after year, surrounded by the same faces, breathing the same air over time. The lines between work and life blurred. Many workers slept in the same building they worked in. Some brought their meals to the shop. Others never married because there simply wasn't time. A few developed quiet relationships with fellow workers, but these were rare, fragile things, hidden beneath layers of propriety and exhaustion. Still, the press room became a kind of home. Loud, smelly, brutal, but familiar, and like any home, it had its rhythms. In the mornings, workers arrived stiff and silent. Fires were lit, ink was mixed, type was checked. The press groaned to life. By midday, the smell of bread or stew might drift in from a corner where someone had tucked away lunch. A few laughs might be shared quick, careful ones. By evening, the room grew heavy with fatigue. Shoulders slumped. Eyes blurred. Hands moved slower. But the press kept turning until the last sheet was printed. The last form was cleared. The last proof was marked. Then silence. But even outside the shop, the press followed them in the pubs and taverns. Printers sometimes gathered not to relax, but to gossip, to talk shop, to vent frustrations, to whisper about rival shops, to speculate about forbidden pamphlets and banned books. They were closer to the heart of political and religious debate than almost anyone else, yet were often not allowed to participate. They printed revolutions, but lived quietly. They produced knowledge, but had little of their own. And still they came back. Every day, not because they loved it, but because the press room was their world. It gave them identity, purpose, a place to stand, even if their backs ached and their fingers bled. And within that place, a strange camaraderie existed, built not on friendship or choice, but on shared survival. The smell of ink, the clatter of type, the weight of silence broken only by a joke, a cough, or the slow creak of the press. These were the sounds of their lives, and even if history rarely mentions their names, they were the ones who kept the words alive. The bigger picture outside the press room walls. The world was changing. In the 17th century, Europe stood at a crossroads. New ideas were blooming. Old powers were shifting. Kingdoms were at war, just with swords and soldiers, but with books, ideas, and belief itself. At the center of this quiet revolution was a machine made of wood, iron, and ink. The printing press, what had begun as a mechanical curiosity in the 15th century, was, by now, a force reshaping the continent. And its reach was growing stronger every day. Books, once copied by hand, now spread by the thousands. A single pamphlet could reach cities and towns across entire countries in weeks. With each press pull, more minds were reached, more questions raised, more power challenged. This wasn't just technology, it was transformation. It touched everything. Religion was one of the first great battlegrounds. A century earlier, Martin Luther's 95 Theses had been nailed to a door. But it wasn't. The door that shook Europe was the printing press that followed. His words were copied, printed, smuggled, and passed hand to hand, lighting fires in mines from Germany to England by the 1600s. The ripple effects were still crashing through Europe. Protestant ideas clashed with Catholic doctrine. Religious pamphlets were everywhere. Some were official, many were underground. Some called for peace. Others whispered of rebellion. People read in secret, in attics, in barns, in candlelit corners of quiet homes. Faith was no longer controlled by pulpits alone. It was being debated in ink and type page by page. Science, too, found new life. The old world had answers for everything. The earth was flat. The heavens were fixed. Everything moved according to divine design. But now, something else was taking shape. Galileo's findings, Kepler's diagrams, the strange new writings of thinkers who believed that the world could be measured, tested, and explained. Books made it possible. Ideas could be shared with others who never met. Experiments repeated. Observations recorded, spread, debated. Science became not just discovery but conversation. Even in countries where books were censored, where authors were punished or killed, ideas still found a way to survive, thanks to presses and the workers behind them. And then came philosophy. The questions no one dared to ask aloud were now whispered in pages. What is power? What is truth? Who decides right and wrong? Writers like Hobbes and Descartes, Spinoza and Locke began exploring these thoughts. Their books stirred debate in universities, royal courts. Some feared these thinkers, others admired them. But no one could ignore them, because printed words don't vanish. They stay, they spread, they seed doubt and hope. All of this, the religious shifts, the scientific breakthroughs, the philosophical revolutions, were made possible by printing, and yet the people making it happen, the compositors, the pressman, the apprentices, remained invisible. Behind every printed book, there were hands stained with ink, eyes strained from candlelight, backs bent over type cases. But their names were rarely printed. They didn't write the books. They didn't get the credit. They didn't get rich. The authors, scholars, and philosophers became famous. The kings and popes who banned or promoted their work were remembered. But the printer who set the type, the apprentice who inked the form, the man who hauled reams of paper up narrow stairs, history barely mentioned them. They made knowledge physical, but they were treated as if they had none. Most were poor. Many stayed poor all their lives. They lived in cramped rooms above shops, ate simple food, owned little. Their clothing smelled of oil and ink. Their fingers were blackened from years of work, their lungs filled with dust. Their bodies wore out young, even when printers played a role in revolution, when they smuggled forbidden texts or helped spread rebellion. They did so at great risk. Arrest, beatings, death. In England, during times of political turmoil, presses were raided, equipment smashed, pages burned, printers jailed. Some disappeared entirely, and still they worked. Because the press was more than a job. It was survival, it was purpose. They were part of something bigger, if they could never fully see it. Each page they printed joined an invisible flood. That flood swept through cities and villages, across mountains, into homes, into minds. It changed what people believed. It shaped how they saw the world. It gave them stories, questions, answers, doubts. It gave them power, and yet the press room stayed dark, cold, and harsh, even as kings and generals debated books at court. The men who printed them shivered beside open windows, in smoky rooms, under dripping ceilings, even as nobles gifted leather-bound tomes. The workers who made them barely earned enough to eat. It was a strange contradiction. The very machine that helped break old systems of power was still built on one where knowledge flowed upward. But labor stayed below. But sometimes that labor pushed back. Some print shops became hubs for underground movements. Workers who couldn't read still understood what they were printing. They whispered about the words, passed scraps between friends, shared what they could remember. Some defied order sprinting forbidden pages late at night, hiding them under floorboards until it was safe to distribute. Others fled when caught, moving from town to town, bringing their skills wherever they went. A printer might not own a single book, but he knew what they were worth, because he had paid for them with his time, his health, sometimes even his freedom. And yet, the world rarely looked his way. He was not the philosopher, not the preacher, not the scientist, not the nobleman or poet. He was a shadow behind the page. But without him, the page would not exist. Even today, centuries later, most readers never think of the hands that shaped the books they read, the metal letters, the ink formulas, the hours spent aligning type, pressing pages, binding covers. But in every book from that era, those hands are there. They live between the lines. They echo in the smell of old paper, in the soft imprint of type, in the wear on the spine. The printing press changed Europe, changed the world. It gave rise to revolutions, discoveries, and debates that still shape our lives today. But behind that vast, glorious, unstoppable wave of change stood the forgotten. Men who pulled the levers, pressed the pages, and vanished in the ink. They were not warriors, not kings, not poets. They were workers anonymous, bent-backed, ink-stained. They lived in the shadows of great ideas, yet brought those very ideas into the light. Through endless hours of toil, repetition, and silence, they shaped the foundation of modern thought, one letter at a time. Every day they endured harsh conditions, burning summers, freezing winters, cramped rooms, toxic fumes. Their hands never stopped moving. Their eyes never got rest. Their mistakes were punished, their pain ignored, and still they pressed on. They did not ask for glory. They rarely received thanks. But without them, the world would have remained silent. The printing press may have changed history, but it was their sweat, their patience, their sacrifice that kept it running. They gave us books, ideas, revolutions, and, in return, they got lead dust in their lungs, ink under their nails, and names lost to time. So tonight, remember them. Now imagine lying down on a quiet bed. No metal type to set, no paper to trim, no harsh master watching your every move. Just silence, just rest, sleep, easy knowing you don't have to work that press tomorrow, because someone already did. For all of us. Thank you for watching this journey through time. If this story moved you, taught you something new, or simply made you feel a little more grateful for the printed page, Please like this video and subscribe to our channel, Restless Historian. We bring you the past as you've never seen it before. Until next time, sleep well.